overview. Now we're going to continue our discussion. When we're talking about geopolitical fragmentation, we're going to ask, is this going to bring about a fragmentation on the economic and financial plan as well? The geostrategic rivalry is going to have a consequence on which is going to deglobalization, regionalization of exchange, and especially how companies are going to adapt to this new environment. And here to talk to us today, I'd like to Thierry de La Tour d'Arthez, who's president of the SEB Group, Anne-Christine Champion, co-head of Global Banking and Investor Solutions at the Société Générale, Ramon Fernandez, who's the Group Chief Financial Officer, CMA-CGM, and Agatha Kratz, Director and Partner at the Rhodium Group. Hello, all of you. Thank you very much. Don't mix up your water glasses, because there's still a flu epidemic going around. So let's start with you, Agatha. Is geopolitical fragmentation that we were talking about earlier, can we also see fragmentation for the economy? Can we talk about deglobalization? Well, not necessarily, but we can talk about economic fragmentation. This is what we can see in the marketing data, investing data. And this is fragmentation which is happening in a double way. First of all, the most visible is the disintegration of integrated economy, which is disintegrating between the United States and China for commerce and trade. You know, China is now 14% of American imports. It was 22, 23% 6 years ago. So there's really been a reduction, but also a reduction in investment. And so there's a disintegration of the relationship between China and the United States. And you can't forget as well that there's been a disintegration of China with respect to the Western world. We've got a Chinese economic policy, which is quite paranoid in terms of entrance and it wants to become more independent. So there's a strong reduction of the rest of the world in the Chinese economy. And so we've got a reduction in imports. And so there's been a lot less, you know, they had 5% growth in their economy, but imports remain stagnant. So China's importing a lot less. So two factors of fragmentation. And in addition to this, it's important, there's a third trend, which is a little more complex and which is added to the current complexity, which is an increase of the weight of China in the world trade in terms of production. And this is happening at the same time. So we've got people who are wondering if has there been a decoupling of the world economy, and how can this be true? Whereas, you know, China's increasing its overall weight in the world economy, and these two, and how can it reduce its and a decoupling of China and America, and the weight of China that's increasing. Has there been an acceleration since Russia's invasion of Ukraine? I think that the tipping point of the restructuring of globalization happened with the first trade war between China and the United States, I think, which started the tipping point. But I think that the competition between China and the United States started under the Obama administration. But the tipping point was this first commercial war, and Ukraine had a double effect, but of course it restructures the European value chain rather than the world value chain, and especially the European-Russian value chain, which existed before. But what's very important to understand is that it moves the Chinese-European relationship into a different dimension, which is now strategy. Where beforehand, you know, tensions between China and Europe were commercial, trade, you know, all about fair and just trade between the two powers. And now with Ukraine, and with the participation of, you know, sort of like China in Russia's war effort, there's we're looking at a relationship which is a lot more strategic consideration than before. So this is an important change. And we've also got a European economy which is, contrary to the United States, which is more dependent today on China than it was 5 years ago. Then we depend a lot more on Chinese exports than we did 5 years ago. So of course, there could be a European desire to de-risk itself, and to diversify. And of course, then there's the question of Taiwan, which we've talked about quite a lot. Of course, we're going to talk about this again in the current context. If in the event of an invasion, or if the tone were to change, China's tone were to change with respect to Taiwan, could this make a difference on our conversation? Yes, a Chinese crisis, or a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, of course, this would really be a disruptive factor for the coming years. We've calculated everything because we're economists and we like to pose complex questions, but about $2-3 trillion would be necessary or endangered by a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, or even a Chinese blockade of Taiwan. But it would be probably quite more significant. So I would like just to talk about the first panel and who is positive about Taiwan, because we're a situation which is going to be more about stability. And I think their analysis is wrong on 2 points, or could be nuanced. I think there's more risk, more danger under a Trump administration of escalation, because if Trump is less interventionist on the international stage, maybe we could have a Chinese desire to test the American limits a little more. And furthermore, we've got to remember that an invasion or a blockade are two versions of an escalation, of an extreme escalation with Taiwan. But an escalation can happen at a less intense level, with cyber attacks, with sort of like breaking submarine cables, which could happen over the coming months, which could have effects on trade, investment, and world confidence. And you can't forget that China, it's not black and white, invasion or not invasion. There's lots of things that could happen, under the umbrella of explanation. Ramon Fernandez, you've got a privileged observation position in CGM, because container transport is very sensitive to change. So how are you adapting to this? Hello. Of course, CGM is the third shipper, and a lot of a lot of world trade happens on our oceans. So yes, we have a privileged observation post as well, and so we're watching that with quite attentively. Geopolitics and climate change. There's a lot of events that are having an influence on our activities. For geopolitics, it's quite important because 2024 was to be quite a bad year for maritime transport, because we had problems for decarbonizing, capacity, offer, supply, and everything was increasing. And after that, there was sort of like huge demand, which was fluctuating quite a lot. Maybe we get back to, like 2024 should have been a bad year, because prices were going down and we were losing money at the end of, for Q4 2023, we were losing money. And the most probable at the time, those who were forecasting were thinking that 2024 would be continuing this drop, and then sort of like an event happened in the Red Sea, the Houthis, who started firing at ships, and so the access to the Suez Canal was closed. So like the Suez Canal was more or less closed off, whereas the Suez Canal should have gone up by 30%.
Of the traffic of containers in the world. So this is a transportation access which is absolutely vital. So the ships would bypass this itinerary through the Cape of Bonne-Espérance. But, the journey duration is longer, and this has changed the physiognomy of 2024. But as for the political and strategic events on our activities, on our businesses, has a huge impact. How did you adapt? Well, we would adapt on this kind of issues in renewing the assets based on the circumstances. So here it's about reorganizing the logistical chain with the different harbor terminals, for instance, in Malta, because in the past we had to go to Tanger, Algeciras, and then Turkey, and back to the Mediterranean Sea. So you see, it's indeed a huge logistical challenge. And then, you know, things have to be adjusted based on the situation. But it's the same for Panama, the Panama Canal. If there's not enough water, which is the case, well, you need to review the different flows. There used to be 40 different ships passing by. Now it's 25 ships passing by the Canal of Panama. So indeed, we have to readapt, to readjust all the value chain, all the logistical chain. So we need to take into account the size of the ships, the stopovers, and so on and so forth, the duration of the journey, and so on and so forth. As for the financial flows, and Christine Champion, you have indeed an observation point, a privileged observation point at the Société Générale, especially when it comes to the SWIFT system. How are you impacted? How do you adapt yourselves? And what can you see? Well, we see no fragmentation from a financial point of view. The global markets remain global markets, whether it is for the big financial institutions and so on. You know, they keep investing everywhere in the world. But however, what we can see is that there are disruptions, financial flows disruptions, for instance, as Ramon has just said, you know, when there are these logistical aspects that we need to take into account, well, you know, things are becoming more complex, especially when it comes to supporting the businesses, the companies, our clients, in order to face these situations, these issues. And also there are sanctions, especially due to the war in Ukraine. It used to be focused on Russia, but now it's more global. As for the EU, there are a huge amount of sanctions. 280,000 entities in the United States also are penalized. So this means that financial institutions, the businesses need to manage these sanctions that become heavier day after day. So an example is a big infrastructure project. So recently, we've supported one of our clients in Europe, several billions of euros funded, signed, ready to shoot, so to speak, as when it comes to from a financial point of view. But then, you know, there was a Chinese actor. China has imposed a sanction, and this has paralyzed our project. And therefore, we had to adjust ourselves, to adapt ourselves very quickly in such a way that the project could resume, could be completed. So you see, that's how we have to bypass these sanctions, and especially when it comes to the banking business. Adaptation is key. There are risks that are increasing as well. For instance, entities that have been sanctioned, that are subject to sanctions, is increasing. You know, this number is increasing as well. But things are moving, things are changing, and there's a higher risk of sanctions in international business. As for the impact of changes over the corporate world, at SEB, you have a very interesting positioning, because you're present in Ukraine, but also in Russia, and you've decided to stay there in both these countries despite the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. How do you manage this situation? First, as a reminder, you know, with Russia, it's not the first time that there are changes, kind of violent changes taking place. Indeed, after the big happy moment, you know, the perestroika with products that were sold in huge volumes because the populations from the East were obsessed with buying things from products from the West, and then so it was an absolute blessed moment. But then after that, there was the collapsing of the banking system in Russia, and then we have negative figures in Russia. But I think that our colleagues have left Russia, but we have stayed. We've stayed there. So our logic is different. Indeed, we've decided also to stay in Ukraine in supporting our teams there. And by the way, our teams are not in Kiev anymore, but in Warsaw, so they can be protected. But in Russia, we have a plant in St. Petersburg, and we've decided, well, we thought, well, our workforce is not responsible of what's taking place between Russia and Ukraine, so we've decided to stay there and to support them. Indeed, we comply with the rules imposed by Russia, but we've decided that we would stay there as long as we have the authorization to stay there. If one day we have to leave, then we are told to leave, then we would do so. But we're trying to stay there as long as we can. So, Ramon Fernandez, beyond these factors related to the conjecture, the situation, how do you explain the slowdown in international trade? Actually, it's not slowing down; it's less dynamic. Actually, yes and no. Sorry, I'm going to give you figures. There's been an increase of the GDP since the crisis. It's twice less, and since the Ukrainian crisis, it's even lower. In 2024, recently, the exchanges in the goods exchanges has increased slower than the GDP, but the exchanges through containers has increased twice faster. So the containers, the exchange of goods around the world has increased drastically. But the year before, it was more about zero. The level was about zero, whilst the world growth was 3%. Why? Because the behavior in 2023 was different from 2024. 2024, it was more about restoring. So it's about, it's all about the growth in the different economies. And as Agatha said very well, we've never shipped as many goods as before, and it keeps growing. But what is also taking place is there's a true relocation of the production chains since Trump won, if I may say so. The Chinese exports to the United States have kept growing, but less than in the previous period. But what has accelerated is that the exports from China to the Southeast countries or to Mexico, for instance, has accelerated drastically. And the exports from these countries, South Asian countries and Mexico to the United States, have also increased. So the connector countries play a key role. And for those entities shipping goods, the growth is still at the same level. So indeed, we should look at things in a relate. We should see things in a relative manner. For instance, in Asia is a place for exchange which is huge in relation with the reorientation, with the relocation of the production capacities. Now, a hot topic, namely the elephant in the room, or the trade policy that has become a true diplomatic tool. What is your analysis as for the first announcements that Trump has made? The tariffs related to Mexico, an increase of 10% for goods from China. 10% of the tariffs for goods from China. What is your view? This question is for everyone, but first, what do you think, What do you think? Well, we are trying to be realistic. Well, we saw that there was a step forward, a step backward. It's about a pure transaction, it's a balance of power, and probably there are several objectives that are partly contradictory and several teams as well. There's the team promoting tariffs that are very high, so it can be more in favor to the reindustrialization of the United States. Another team saying that this would be bad for inflation, that it would be bad for innovation, and therefore we need to find balance. We are trying to get ready for all the potential scenarios, but I think that the situation is not very clear. Agatha, what do you think? Do you think there will be winners and losers? What about the reality? What do you expect? Actually, the economic analysis that have been done, that have been made, especially as for the first trade war, so to speak, and indeed we're losers in the context of economic fragmentation, but also at the same time there are countries that are winners. Mexico, Vietnam are the countries who are the main winners because they've become connector countries, but also increasingly, they've become assembly countries with Chinese inputs, entrants being assembled in Mexico or in Vietnam, and then these countries have become countries for assemblies to assemble pieces. So indeed, Southeast Asian countries and the countries of the ASEAN are strongly impacted. But the only country, the non-emerging country, the only developed country that finds interest there are the United States, especially when it comes to battery, solar panels, although we thought that solar panels were now in the hands of China. And it's more Biden's effect rather than Trump. It's about carrot with the Lira, CHIPS Acts, with huge impact. But it was quite surprising to see that the United States and also Taiwan that are re-emerging when it comes to these matters. When it comes to Trump, do you think that one of the consequences for Europe, Trump and China, do you think that it would be more imported Chinese products because Europe is indeed quite a big consumer of Chinese products? Indeed, what we expect is that the 10% tariffs are probably going to increase. This is the bad news for year 2025. We think that in the next 6 months there will be negotiation also with China in a context where the American president hopes to obtain from Xi Jinping an influence over Vladimir Putin in the context of the war of Ukraine. But I think that in the next 6 months reality is going to settle. And the actual worries, American worries, vis-à-vis China and the Chinese policies, economic policies, are going to be a priority for the American government. So in this context, the 10%, 20%, of course, there are going to be Chinese exports that will have to be relocated. But also the Chinese economy now is quite poor, with exports that are one of the main pillars of Chinese growth for 2024. And if you remove this pillar, well, China is going to become weaker from an economic point of view. So it has to export, especially towards the global south countries, but also to other destinations. It can be positive, it can be also negative, because in these global price makers, as a global price makers, they may destroy economic situations there. But when it comes to Europe, we're closer to the American demand. So quite naturally, the flows that were supposed to be directed to the United States are now directed to Europe. But we can be pessimistic when it comes to the Chinese and European relations in 2025, because in this context, even if we want to be negotiating further with China, we will have to, with Digitrade, we'll have to put in place commercial defenses, trade defenses, and tariffs to avoid these export flows to destroy even further our industry. So I think that 2025 is going to be really tricky for the Chinese and European relations, and our companies are, should get ready for that. So Trump said, either you come and settle your company in the United States, or you will have to pay tariffs. So I'm turning to you, Thierry de La Tour, as someone from the industry sector. What do you think? What about the settlements of companies? I'd like to say something about the relations between China and the United States, and also China and Europe. First, I'd like to say the following thing. I've been in the business, which is the most dislocated. 90% of our products sold in the world come from China, and now a bit from Vietnam. Who's implemented this? Well, the Americans, because they had dislocated all their production to Mexico at the time of, in the 70s, and because it was not sufficient, given the pressure from Walmart, everyday low price, there was pressure as a consequence, and so the American had transferred anything in Mexico to China, entrusting everything to the Chinese. This translated into two facts. First, China, that had discovering new things, has started to develop their own similar products. But now, in our business in the United States, the average price is half of what it is in Europe. But you have two plants in the United States. I think you have two plants there. Yes, but we're a bit special, because we have two plants in the United States. We have also plants in Germany. But anyway, as for the United States, we are a very high level of the market. We manufacture saucepans in inox of very high quality, but also we have a plant of coffee machines, for professional coffee machines. So indeed, your segment is very special. It's very specific. Indeed, we have 50 plants in the world, and we manufacture products with high added values. As for the United States, I think you all know that the first reaction of the Chinese companies, and we're also part of that because we're also present in China, it's about transferring a lot to Vietnam. But there will be limits, because there will be, the industry is decreasing in the United States. But any radical measures related to tariffs would be a huge inflation factor. And this is an American obsession. And I think that in our business, relocating the production of coffee machines is not really the priority of any American presence. Now, when it comes to the relations between China and Europe, I'm coming back to, what I said earlier. We're a dislocated business, and nowadays our competitors are the supermarkets brands. For instance, in France, when it comes to saucepans, one saucepan out of two is our brand, and the others come from China, and are sold under supermarkets brands such as Carrefour and so on. So whether there's going to be a relocation from China to Europe, well, this has started, but there's a difference. Does Europe want to consume more? I'm not sure in the mature countries, because household appliances, different households are very well equipped in terms of appliances. But I think that what is the solution is innovation. The Chinese are very innovating, very great innovators. I think that we have to make things relative. There are still huge risks, but when it comes to the tariffs between Europe and the United States, at least those imposed by the United States, well, actually, this wouldn't change much for us because, you know, given the prices in the United States, we would sell nearly nothing in Europe. Do you think there's a change in the behavior from your partners, your clients, given these threats related to the increase of tariffs? Not really. If, for instance, when it comes to China, it's our top country. We are the leader there. We are the only foreign group to have a company which is listed at the Chinese Stock Exchange in China. And I think that it's about relaunching the consumption, the domestic consumption. It's about infrastructure and export. There were breaks to export. As for infrastructure, the different regions in China are indebted. So it's about domestic consumption. The arrival of Xi Jinping, when it comes to breaking this consumption trend, this is a challenge for us, for our clients, figuring out whether consumption market is going to be the main one. There are measures to redeploy consumption, so on and so forth. It's in progress in China. I hope that it's going to be successful. But it's also a development of e-commerce, but at a global level, in the emerging countries, we take care of the daily life of people. It's more about middle-class people. Their obsession is to live better. So I think that in the long run, this will continue. The clients will be happy to be part of it. And as for mature countries, it's about innovation because everyone has everything, but they just want something innovating. You refer to, well, actually, the American policy is also about going to the space, Mars and the moon, whatever. So what about, is there a change in the behavior of your clients? We refer to changes as for tariffs. Indeed, the smoke curtain, so to speak, has to fall back. When it comes to investment decisions, these are strategic decisions. It's more about looking into what is behind the scene. What are the main trends behind all that? 31% of the world production is manufactured in China because a few years ago the wages were far lower than in the United States. So these are drastic changes that have taken place. Also, these challenges related to added value on production. There are also new value chains that are taking place, and that's where we can see changes in behavior. For instance, in the automotive industry, batteries, for EVs. This is the main element of EV cars, electric vehicles. And this is a true topic when it comes to relocation. The relocation of the plants manufacturing batteries that were used to be in thermal vehicles. But actually, it's also about the diversification of suppliers. There's also an approach related to interesting things, namely, in the form of partnerships. When it comes to the construction of a plant in Douai, producing 24 gigawatt-hour of batteries, it will be an Asian actor. That's this kind of behavior that we can see with our clients. Do you see a regionalization of the financial flows? Do you think that this can be a consequence of this new map? No regionalization at the moment. The dollar remains money without any rivals. 80% of the exchange operations is done in dollars. 60% of the reserves in the central banks is in dollars. It used to be 20% 25 years ago. So you see the change is very slow, but dollars is dominant in the stock exchange market. It's 23% of global capitalization. China is 8 times lower. So no regionalization. The Asian investors, the European investors invest a lot in the United States to seize the opportunity related to dynamism there. And when it comes to banks supporting the investors, investment opportunities, either in capital or in debt in the different regions of the world. When it comes to tariffs, there's another subject which is key for your respective businesses, namely the regulatory fragmenting. It's very important. For instance, between you have the United States on the one hand, who deregulate, and Europe, which is not taking this direction yet. Ramon Fernandez, what do you think? As per the previous item, I think that we all agree these distortions are very slow. The changes are very slow. All the figures say the same thing. It's going to continue, and it's going to accelerate with the new American administration, the new American government. So we'll have to see how the different economic players will adapt themselves. But anyway, it's the trend. Now, when it comes to the regulatory fragmentation, first, I was in Brussels last week. There's a new commission, new parliament to introduce the different challenges of the group, and so on and so forth. And I was there when the commission presented its competitiveness compass. I think that we all understood that there's something taking place anyway. Well, we, the Europeans, and the European institutions, will we be in the capacity to make decisions quickly? I don't know about it, but I think that Davos, the shock related to what is taking place, what the American government is doing now, I think that we have to act because it's urgent. Although we will need time. Indeed, we'll need time, but we don't have so much time, actually. In our businesses, there are challenges, there are issues related to the application of regulations related to the environment, net zero carbon 2050. We have intermediate objectives that are very ambitious, but this being said, our clients like it when they travel with decarbonated fuel, but as for paying for that, it's quite a hot topic. So you mean it's not their priority? No, I didn't say that. I'm saying that it's their priority, but it should be more expensive. But actually, it's costly. There's no free decarbonation. It's absolutely impossible. So we're in Europe. We have the ETSs. There are, a number of regulations of all kinds. It's very good. But, we're in a world where these rules don't exist. So we'll have to push forward for the competition equality to be fair. And as for shipping, this is a regime which is global. So in France, some may think that it's a French system, but it's not only French. It's also European, and it's also global. So if there are changes in a more or less sustainable manner in the different countries, we need to keep in mind that this results in competition distortions as for businesses that are existing at a global level. And when looking into that, we should keep in mind also that sometimes there are foreign policies that work well, and amongst the 5 maritime producers, there are 4 of them who are European entities.
So we've got to control all the logistic chains. We saw that was absolutely fundamental. So environmental standards, to what extent can that have an impact on the competitivity of European companies? I already know what your answer is going to be. I'm just going to. I'm not so afraid of artificial intelligence, and then I see as sort of like Chinese invasion, and then there's also the, the invasion of standards and regulations. This is the question. And yeah, everything is standardized in Europe. We spend all our life, working on this, and I think we're walking on our heads here. And I think we've got to say it. It's absolutely intolerable because we're going to die suffocated by regulations because we're being taken over by all our competitors. But there are two things that strike me and which come back to what you're saying on the environment. Is first, we're walking on our heads because, we're talking about things where even scientifics are saying that there isn't, an environmental. It's become, it's become a. You can say anything you like about this. You're talking about the principle of precaution. Yes, of course, and I think I'd like to think about the principle of innovation as well. That we've been in the market now for 167 years. So of course we're a responsible company. We'd have died before. I think that's we've got to find reason, and we're going to have to listen to scientists because there are things that we shouldn't. Of course, there are things we've got to forbid and prohibit, but we've got to let people innovate if it's not dangerous. And the second thing, I think that there's a very dangerous French state is, sort of like implementing regulations before Europe. We always want to be the good pupil, the star pupil in Europe. But I think in a world where it's, sort of like to legislate just for France, it's suicidal because it's going to kill our industry, because we're not going to be able to export or sell things in markets that haven't regulated. So I think it's important we've got to be part of, an entity like Europe and let Europe regulate, and then afterwards regulate in France afterwards, but not beforehand. And of course, the environment is fundamental. I'm even going to go further than that. And maybe you think it's the contrary of what I'm saying, but I think the environment is a fantastic opportunity for industrialists. We see it. We thought it was. We think it's wonderful now. Sort of like a couple of years ago, people didn't repair things. Now customers and our consumers want to repair things. So recycling and repairing things wasn't the case 10 years ago. It is the case today. So I think that industrialists have a golden opportunity through sustainable development because consumers are going to ask more and more. And I think it's the industry which is going to help us to decarbonize and not reduce growth. But it's not necessarily. Let's talk about finance, because we were talking about regulations in the environmental sector, but we're talking about deregulation in the United States. This is going to be a problem for French banks. And Christine, how are they going to remain competitive if they're deregulated in the United States? I think that it's already a problem. There's already a problem for European banks, and beyond that, we're talking about the whole European economy, and we were talking about slow developments. I think it's important to look at what these slow developments are. The financial markets in America and companies are financed on the bond market 90%. In France, it's 60% in the banks. So 220% of the European GDP, and American banks have 86%. So you can see that the wiggle room in Europe to fix the European economy, there's a lot less wiggle room there. And I think that's a fundamental problem, which has been a slow development over the last 20 years and after the last financial crisis, and which you've got to remedy this today. This is one of the things which was pointed out by Marie-Audrey in her report and in the reports that were talked about by Christian Noy. So we've got to deregulate. No, not necessarily deregulate, but we've got to have the regulation evolve, sort of like for securitization, which enables us to transform a real estate loan into a security. And, the European market was 75%, and now it's 5%. That means that the capacity for companies to obtain finance is less in Europe than in the United States, and the proposals, which are quite easy to make, that if there are other deregulations, of course, it's going to create a spread in competition which is quite significant. Thank you very much to all four of you. We know that we all have busy agendas, so I'm going to stop there. Thank you, Anne-Christine Champion, Société Générale. Thank you, Agatha Kratz, Ramon Fernandez, and Thierry de La Tour from SEB. But there are a lot. Thank you very much to all of you.